The next morning, Mrs. Hamilton took the baby and a basket of quilting squares and went down the hill to see her sister-in-law, Mary Hamilton. Anne could have gone too if she'd wanted to, as long as she was back in time to carry lunch to the men in the south field. The plowing was almost done now, but because this field was so far from the cabin, Anne had been taking the new meal down every day. She didn't want to go to Aunt Mary's. Ladies' talk was often just as dull as politics. Besides, Anne didn't like to quilt. Instead, she spent the morning on her hands and knees, weeding around the vegetables. It felt good to turn up the rich brown earth and to work until her back and arms ached. Sometimes when she worked like this, Anne felt it was the strength from her own body that was making the vines so stout and healthy and turning the pumpkins so golden. She felt her own hard work going down into the ground and making the potatoes grow. She worked until time to go to the fields with lunch. David saw Anne first as she approached with a pail of food in each hand. He dropped his hoe and started to meet her. "Come on, boys," he called loudly. "Here's little Rachel Peck with a pail of gingerbread." Anne stopped right where she was. She put the 2 pails down at her feet and turned around to go home. David could hand out the food and bring the empty pails home when he came. She wouldn't stay and visit if he was going to poke. Fun at her. Anne walked slowly up the hill, past the flax field, the cornfield, the barn, through the vegetable garden, to the cabin. She sat down on the step with a cup of milk and a piece of cold meat and felt very, very sorry for herself. Arthur Scott was gone, Andy was being hateful again, and David was teasing. Anne went to get her diary. At least now she could write what she pleased without anyone looking over her shoulder. When she reached up on the shelf, the diary wasn't there. She felt along the whole length of the shelf, first quickly, frantically, then slowly and carefully. She took down Samantha and the Gettysburg shoes and the blue ribbon, and then the shelf was bare. Anne thought back to the night before. She remembered then that she had left the diary on the step when she'd gone down the road. She searched the front of the cabin. She looked through the inside of the cabin. It wasn't there. David must have picked it up and hidden it as part of his joke on her. Well, she wouldn't ask him. It would only mean more teasing. She would have to get along without it until he felt like giving it back. Suddenly, Anne wanted Margaret more than she ever had in all the time she had been there. 2 tears started in her eyes and rolled slowly down her cheeks. Oh, she was lonesome for girl talk and girl play and a girl. She looked at Samantha, staring up from the table where she'd been dropped. Anne thought of the time Samantha had been along when she and Margaret had dressed up and played house. They would sneak off from the boys and give make-believe tea parties with their dolls. All afternoon it would be, "Good day, Mrs. Jones," and "How are your children, Mrs. Smith? Keeping well, I hope." Oh, it had been lovely, lovely. All at once, Anne dried her eyes. She was going to have a tea party right now. She would find a pretty place in the woods where she could set out a pretend table and gather pretend food. It wouldn't be the same alone with just Samantha. But she was going to do it anyway, and she was going to dress up. Anne tied the blue ribbons on her hair. She put on a fresh pink apron, her long white stockings, and she sat down to put on her blue Gettysburg shoes. She started with her right foot. She put her toes into the shoe and pulled. She pulled. She unlaced as far as she could unlace and pulled again. Her foot simply would not go in. She couldn't squeeze it in. In one summer, her feet had grown too big. And all the time her Gettysburg shoes had been sitting on the shelf, wasted. Anne felt the tears starting again, but she brushed them away impatiently. No matter what, she was going to have a fancy tea party. If she couldn't wear her shoes, she would take something else to make the party special. As she slipped off her white stockings to go barefoot, her eyes lighted on her mother's chest in one corner of the cabin. This was the chest that was never opened, that was waiting for someday. It had her father's silver-buckled shoes in it, her mother's silk dress, the linen tablecloth, and the 12 lavender-flowered plates. Quickly Anne made up her mind. If no one else would use the plates, she would. Carefully, she opened the chest and unwrapped 2 of the lavender-flowered plates, one for herself and one for Samantha. The plates were even more beautiful than Anne had remembered, and so thin. She would take good care of them. When she finished with them, she would wrap them up just the way she had found them. No one need ever know that 2 lavender-flowered plates had been used this afternoon at a tea party on Hamilton Hill. Carrying the plates in one hand and Samantha in the other, Anne went out the door of the cabin. Behind her, the Gettysburg shoes and white stockings lay on the floor where she had left them. The lid of her mother's chest gaped open. It didn't matter, Anne thought. She'd be back in plenty of time to straighten up before anyone else came home. Beyond the pea vines and the pumpkins, at the edge of the woods that led down to the McPhails, there was a perfect place for a tea party. Enough trees had been cut down so that there was room to spread a party. Enough trees stayed up to keep a party secret. Standing, Anne could see the cabin, but once she sat down, she and Samantha and the flowered plates and the tea party would be hidden in a world all their own. She propped Samantha up against a stump. In front of Samantha stretched a soft green velvet tablecloth of moss. In the center of the moth tablecloth, Anne arranged 3 pine cones and a spray of ferns as a decoration. Then, at Samantha's place and her own, Anne set the lavender-flowered plates. Already the party looked beautiful. Anne ran back and forth, bringing wild grapes to put on the flowered plates, placing large leaves on the table as extra serving pieces. On one of the leaves, she arranged a handful of acorns. She filled another with red dogwood berries, which looked just like little cinnamon candies they used to have back home in Gettysburg. Anne stood looking critically down at the table. If only Margaret were here. For a moment, she hesitated to sit down. It was so very quiet. When she started party talk with Samantha, was it going to seem lonely, just her own voice in the wood? As she looked around for something more to add to the table. As she did, she happened to glance towards the cabin. Coming out of the door and heading straight for the tea party was Mrs. Hamilton. Anne didn't move. There was no use. Her mother had seen her. She could try to hide the flower plates, but that wouldn't be any use either. Her mother had already been in the cabin and seen the open chest. Anne waited, her heart pounding and her eyes on the ground. When she finally looked up, her mother was standing quietly beside her and looking at the tea party table. Anne held her breath, but for some reason her mother didn't look cross at all. Instead, there was the same kind of lovingness in her face as she had when she rocked the baby after he had been crying for a long time. Then Mrs. Hamilton turned to Anne and smiled. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Jones," she said. "I hope I am not too late for tea. And is this your daughter?" Mrs. Hamilton nodded toward Samantha. "My, how she's grown." All at once, Anne's throat felt tight with love and gratitude. Quickly, she moved Samantha's flowered plate in front of her mother and gave Samantha an oak leaf. "Oh, do sit down, Mrs. Smith," Anne said. "And will you have cream or lemon in your tea?" She poured cups of make-believe tea from a make-believe silver teapot. A brown rabbit stopped near the table and looked with interest before moving on. Somewhere, a squirrel chattered noisily. A redbird made himself at home on a branch of yellow elm nearby. The 2 ladies daintily sipped the afternoon away and talked the loveliest party talk, all about husbands and disobedient children and new babies and stylish hats. "And have you heard," Anne's mother asked in the most fashionable voice, "that my brother-in-law, Mr. John Hamilton, is going east soon for salt and supplies? I do believe I shall ask him to bring back a new pair of shoes for my daughter. Her feet grow so." Anne covered up a smile behind the oak leaf she was using for a fan. "Blue shoes would be lovely," she said. "I am sure your daughter would like blue shoes." The sun had dropped low, and the trees were throwing long shadows across the velvet moss and vegetable garden when Mrs. Hamilton and Anne gathered up Samantha and the flowered plates to go back to the cabin. Anne took a last look back at the woods before she left. As she looked, the red bird dropped down onto the green moss and began to eat from the leaf filled with dogwood berries. Anne caught her breath at the beauty of it. Strange, she had never really noticed before how lovely the woods were on Hamilton Hill. When Anne and her mother reached the cabin, they found Mr. Hamilton, David, and Daniel already there. Daniel was glowering. "Are you aware of how late it is?" he asked. Mrs. Hamilton handed Anne the plates to put back. Then she turned and faced her 3 impatient men on the doorstep. "Once in a while," she said decisively, "there comes a time in the Western country when there is something more important than an hour of work or a meal on time." Mrs. Hamilton went inside to prepare